And welcome back again. You're listening to Breakthrough Entertainment live on 1480 AM KPHX in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm Dave alongside Trish and Eric. I still see Joseph, and there's Kathleen Joy behind the glass.
His voice can't help but change when he
I don't know.
her.
It just sort of changes. What can I say?
I know.
Almost
I
like
took
puberty.
a little liberties with the music here.
Okay, yeah, there we go. And I like that music because guess what? Joining us now is a man of many talents. He's executive producer for Real Time with Bill Maher since it debuted on HBO in 2003. Produced the first 1,100 episodes of Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher.
One of my favorites.
Oh, yes, no doubt about it. And received 8 Emmy nominations, 3 consecutive Cable Ace Awards for Best Talk Series. The writer of The Gospel According to Thomas Jefferson, Charles Dickens, and Count Leo Tolstoy. Discord. A big welcome to Scott Carter. Thank you so much for being here.
I'm delighted to be here, and it's great. This is the closing weekend of the play.
Yes, it
That's
is.
not great. That's sad to me.
It is sad.
Well, and yet, but it keeps going. I mean, it's and so I've been delighted by the run here, delighted by the reception. I know Matt, August, the director, and the actors have had a great time here, as they did in Tucson before coming up here. So it's great, and we're going to do a talk back tonight, which I love doing. After the show is over, and I think maybe 1 or 2 or 3 of the actors will join me, but those are always interesting.
Well, this is a great play. We saw it, about 2 weeks ago, and they did have a question and answer period with 2 of the actors. Fantastic. The acting is just sensational, but the play is amazing, and it's really a new comedy that takes the 3rd U.S. president, the author of a Christmas Carol and the author of War and Peace, locks them in a room with no exit and have them hash out their views of Scripture and the true meaning of existence. I just thought that was amazing. The setting was incredible. There were some special effects but simple special effects that made it even more amazing. Did you have anything to do with that part of it, the set?
I would give all the credit to anything visual or the music, the sounds, all to Matt August, our director, and who has assembled an incredible team. And this team has really been together since October of 2013. We began rehearsing in L.A. then. We did 101 performances in 2 different theaters, the NoHo Arts and the Geffen Playhouse, in 2014. Then we took a little bit of a break, and then they began rehearsing again. We did the show in Tucson and then brought it to Phoenix. So the other 2, Mark Gagliardi, who plays Dickens, is new to the cast. He's like the 3rd stooge. There was always new. Sometimes it was Shemp. Sometimes it was Curly. Sometimes it was Curly Joe. They always had to get a guy named Joe to be the 3rd. But the other 2 actors and all of the set designers and costumes, these people have been we've been working together for 2.5 years now. So the actors playing Jefferson and Tolstoy in particular know so much about these characters that they did not know when we started. And so they're experts. So very often they will correct me on something, whereas when we started, I was the expert on everything. And now they will have read something more recently than I have, so they'll have a better grasp of it. And that's really delightful because it's something that I began to work on almost 30 years ago. I had a near-death asthma attack in 1987. And I think we talked about some of this, I think, the last time.
That's right.
When I phoned in before I came to the palatial studios here. And
I wasn't here,
and didn't meet everybody. So I was just imagining what this place was like. And anyway, so it's a delight to actually be here and see everybody in person. But I had a near-death asthma attack and was in the hospital. I was a stand-up comic at the time in New York in the late 80s. And then began to think when I came out of the hospital that maybe I should start addressing some of the topics that are talked about in the play. Why are we here? What kind of life are we supposed to have? Is there a God? If so, what kind of life does that God want us to lead? And so that led me to just this open exploration of things that I'd heretofore been indifferent or hostile to. And so it made me just consider things. And so I made this pact with the universe that for at least 2 years, anytime anybody wanted to talk to me about religion or philosophy or anything spiritual, I couldn't just brush them off. I'd have to listen. So, for instance, if I was in New York and I was walking down Broadway and somebody was haranguing a crowd with a Mr. Microphone about John 3:16 or whatever, I couldn't keep walking. I would have to stop and listen. Or if people wanted to give me a pamphlet on the street, I would have to take it. The end of the world is going to be October 24th. I'd have to take it and read it and consider it. Or if people wanted me to go to a ceremony, I'd have to go to the ceremony. Well, anyway, during this time, I saw a show that Bill Moyers, who has since become a friend, one of the delights of this long gestation process, has been getting to meet all these incredible people and having them give me suggestions. Many of them are in the play now. And Moyers did a show called The World of Ideas, and he interviewed a man who was coming out with a new edition of the Jefferson Bible, and that's why I first heard about the Jefferson Bible. And it's amazing to think that Jefferson, during his first term as president, and he was the first president to live 8 years in the White House, then they just called it the President's House, and they didn't call it Washington, D.C. He referred to it as Washington City. So he's working as president all day long, and at night he gets 2 identical copies of the Bible and goes through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and takes a razor and cuts up, out of those 4 books, he cuts out what he likes. And then he gets a scrapbook and he makes his own original compilation. And then later, when he's retired at Monticello, in 1820, he dies 1826 at the age of 83 on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. He does this task again for himself, but he expands it to Greek, Latin, French, and English. Mm-hmm. And I've actually seen this book in the Smithsonian.
Wow.
And it's something that it's been kind of a touchstone of my existence for the last 30 years, and to actually finally have seen it was kind of an incredible thing. But there's a little documentary the Smithsonian put out because they actually had to go back to the book and sort of redo it, take it apart, and put it together because the glue that Jefferson used over a period of time was warping, and the whole book was warped. So they had to go back and restore it. And one of the things they mentioned when they were going back and doing this restoration, Jefferson was so meticulous that when he took a razor and was cutting out verses, there is not one instance of his razor hitting the ink of the line above or the line below where he was cutting the verse out. Every cut was a clean cut.
That's meticulous. Talk about that. I mean, that's incredible. And then you learn about a couple of years later, I think, of Charles Dickens, his version of the gospel.
And Dickens had 10. He and his wife had 10 children. When the 5th was born, he had such an overwhelming sense of gratitude that he'd gone from being. I mean, when he was 12, his family was put into a debtor's prison, and he was taken out of school. His mother let his older sister stay in school.
A debtor's prison.
A debtor's prison. If you've seen or read Little Dorrit, or there are other Dickens books where someone is put in a debtor's prison, and you were. It's kind of crazy. You were put into a prison, and you were expected to stay there until your debts were paid off. And the way this worked for the Dickens family was they put him to work in a factory, and he was supposed to. And he had a little room, a let room with a single candle. And he was supposed to save all the money that he was making in this factory, and he was supposed to eventually, over a period of time, at the age of 12, buy his family's freedom.
Oh, wow. I don't think that is even legal anymore these days.
Well, no, and when Dickens, and then that's when he was 12. By the time he's 22, he's one of the most famous authors in the world. So he had this incredible sense of gratitude for all that had just shifted in his life, and so he wrote this gospel for his children, and he read it to them so many times that they all had it memorized before they could learn to read or write, before they had learned to read or write themselves. And he was kind of an incredible character. One of the things that one of his daughters, after he died, she talked about when they were kids, they would look into his study, and he would keep mirrors around him, and he would get up and he would go into a mirror, hold his face just a few inches away from the mirror, and he would form his face, he would contort his face and do alternate voices, and he would be acting out the scenes. Then he'd rush to the desk and write it down. Then he'd go back to the mirror.
Oh. Wow.
And he was an incredible guy. We had a guy on Real Time last night named Scott Adams, who's the creator of Dilbert. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons we had him on is that he is a trained hypnotist. and a student of persuasive techniques. So he was on talking about Donald Trump and how Donald Trump uses all these techniques. But I was telling him, that Dickens was a protege of Mesmer, one of the original hypnotists.
Yeah.
And that when Dickens was doing his lectures, he would take the gas lights in the auditorium and he would keep them up. They never went to dark. He would keep them up because he wanted to have eye contact with every member of the audience, and he thought that he was actually doing a mass hypnosis as he was performing.
Well, maybe he was.
And maybe he was. He was an incredible performer, and a lot of people think that his early death, he died at the age of 58, was due to the fact that he did over 300 public performances in America and all over Britain, and he would put so much energy into them that he often had to have a doctor by his side when he finished the show because he was completely exhausted. And one particular scene that he used to do was from Oliver Twist of Bill Sikes strangling and throttling Nancy. And he would put so much into it that women would faint in the audience, but also it kind of maybe precipitated his own death.
Wow, that's called deep trance identification. Actually, I took I'm a master practitioner in neurolinguistic programming, so I'm very familiar with Mesmer, and it has a lot of elements of hypnosis, Ericksonian hypnosis. So Tony Robbins is probably the most well known of the NOP.
Well, it's interesting. There was in an early draft of the play, I have Jefferson arguing with Dickens about it because when Jefferson was in France with Benjamin Franklin, there was actually an attempt to discredit Mesmer, that Benjamin Franklin was asked by the king to conduct these experiments. And so Jefferson would have had a low opinion of all this, plus also Jefferson so believed in reason and the ability. I mean, Jefferson was a child of the Enlightenment. And that notion was we have a clockwork universe, and the way that we find out about God is by finding out more about science and actually how the world works. Everything we learn about science is God speaking to us.
Interesting.
And yielding bit by bit his secrets to us.
That's fascinating. It sort of makes sense too. And yes.
Well, I just wanted to say that I thought, of course, I didn't see the previous Dickens, but Mark Gagliardi did a phenomenal job of having that energy.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yes.
It was palpable. You could just feel how much energy he was putting into that performance, but not as a performance, but just as Charles Dickens, just burning off all that energy and every motion that he does. Even, I mentioned it to him last week, even when he's not in the spotlight, not the main character that's speaking right now, it was just a palpable, it was like another character on stage, his energy.
Yeah, and there's a line in the play that was absolutely based in truth, which is that Dickens had a pact with himself that for every hour he wrote, he would have to walk an hour. And when he came to America, he actually organized marathon walks in Boston and other cities, and he would plan out who was going to be able to participate in it and what the path was going to be, and he would be there with a stopwatch timing everybody. He was just a sort of inhuman or superhuman bundle of energy that just went nonstop. I mean, Dickens is so incredible. We think of him as a novelist, and yes, he was a novelist, but he was also editing magazines, and he was acting in plays at night.
Well, I had no
and
idea.
he had a house that was 30 miles outside of London, and he would often walk back and forth to the house. I mean, he was just, and it was, and I think that the memory of being 12, being taken out of school, having your family thrown into prison, is a reality that haunted him forever after.
Yeah.
So the notion that perhaps, even though he had money when he was an adult, maybe he could lose it. Maybe the audiences would turn on him. Maybe people would stop coming to see him or read his books. I think he always had those kind of nightmares.
And it may have been a big motivation for him to do what he did, perhaps. And then, so after you learned about Jefferson and then Dickens, then you learned about what was called the Gospel in Brief.
Yeah, Leo Tolstoy. Well, Tolstoy this was... I learned about Jefferson in 87 and Dickens in 96, and then it was 98 that I learned about Tolstoy. And when I learned about Tolstoy, it was one of these moments where you go, oh, this is incredible. Tolstoy did the same thing that the other two did, and I could put them all together. But also at the same time, oh, I'm not going to get finished with the first draft for another 2 or 3 years because I'm going to have to study Tolstoy until I can feel confident in being able to speak in his voice. And, Tolstoy was fascinating because, and there's a line in the play about this, he was the second most wealthy and famous man in Russia next to the Tsar. He was titled, he was Count Tolstoy, and which was a source of humiliation to him. It was a source of embarrassment. He becomes, with War and Peace and then Anna Karenina, he becomes the leading novelist of his day, and the effect that it has upon him is for him to want to kill himself. His family even they take away ropes, they take away his guns. They watch him at dinner lest he take a knife or fork and plunge it into his chest. And the way that he saves himself from killing himself, because he had a brother, Nikolenka, who had gotten tuberculosis, and he'd watched him die over a period of time. And so that got him obsessed with death. And also, Tolstoy was kind of that typical effusive, overly emotional Russian that's both charming and exhausting. So he was looking out his window one day, and he saw peasants working in the field, and he thought, why do they keep going? I've got wealth, they don't. I can travel, they can't. I can own property, they can't. I mean, in the early days when they were serfs before they were liberated, but still they had no money, so they weren't able to buy property. I have education, they don't have it. Why do they keep going? So he then started dressing like a peasant and going out into the fields and working with them. And over a period of time, what he figured out was it's their faith that sustains them. So then he thought, well, great, if I go to their chapel and start worshiping with them, not just working all week long, but then on Sundays I'm going to go to their chapel, that's going to save me. So he goes to their chapel, and when he walks in, they all turn and bow to him. So that further embarrasses him. And then he is appalled by the way the catechism has been rewritten in Russia to really reinforce the Tsar. So the first commandment is not just honor one God, but honor the Tsar. And the fourth, honor your mother and your father and the Tsar. And he hates this. So then he spends the next 2 years, he knows Latin, but he spends the next 2 years teaching himself Greek so that he can go back to the original scriptures. And this is funny, it was in earlier versions of the play. He wasn't that good at teaching himself Greek, and so he made a lot of translation errors. So one of them is he read one bit of scripture to say that Jesus said everybody should make their own shoes, and he took that literally. And so he hires a cobbler to come to his palatial estate and begin to teach him how to make shoes. And when he finally makes shoes for himself, he's so proud of himself that he walks 18 miles to this monastery because he wants to show the monks there, look, I made the shoes, but by the time he gets there, his feet are bleeding. And they have to telegraph back to his home to have a golden coach with his family crest on it sent for him to bring him back home, which was, of course, humiliating to him.
Wow. You really have gone into depth on this. Now, there was almost a fourth person added to the play, I understand, Sir Isaac Newton. I believe someone suggested that. Is
this
that right?
Was Shirley MacLaine came to when I first did a first draft. Everybody hated it. My wife, my agent, my lawyer, everybody detested it. I put it away for 3 years. Then I went back and started looking at it and realizing, oh, I know what works and doesn't. Let me start paring this down. Then I started doing a series of readings where I first went over to the house of Gary Shandling was a friend of mine. He grew up in Tucson. We went to the same high school. And I called him up and said, I've got this project I've never told you about. Can I come over to your house and read it? And he said, of course, because Gary, who just died, was one of the most open-hearted people. I attended the memorial service for him. That was one of the most moving evenings I've ever been to. It was 2.5 hours. It was produced by Judd Apatow.
Oh, really? And he's been on our show, too.
Well, he's great. In fact, he just emailed me a week ago and said, I found, because he's been going through Gary's stuff with Gary's cousin in the house in L.A., and he found the back of an envelope on which it was an envelope from the Four Seasons in Hawaii where Gary used to stay, and on the back it said, It said, I'm not going to get this exactly right, but the sense was, remember gift comment from Scott Carter, quote, "That's why you are here."
Oh,
and
wow.
and so Judd called me and said, "I've got this thing," and I said, "Could you send that to me? I'd like to frame it." And he goes, "Do you know what he's referring to?" And Judd was actually going to the airport, and he was going to be gone. I said, "When you get back, I will tell you, but I'll tell you right now." There was a period after It's Gary Shandling's show and then Larry Sanders where Gary kind of stopped, and he became a little bit of a hermit, and he'd had a movie that failed. Larry Sanders' show was over. He had a relationship that was over. And anyway, he kind of stopped, and I was having dinner with him one night at Ivy on the Shore, and at the table, beyond the table where we were sitting, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys came and sat down. And so he was in the same seat that Gary was in, and Brian Wilson's wife sat in the analogous seat to the one that I was in. So I'm looking at Gary. I'm framing it so that I'm looking at Gary, and then a few feet away I'm looking at Brian Wilson. And I said to Gary, "Do you know about Brian Wilson?" And Brian Wilson had a lot of similarities to Gary because he was mammothly talented and had a horrific childhood. And the scars of that have always been with him, as have always been with Gary. But I was telling Gary how recently Brian Wilson had gone back and completed this album he started in 1967, Smile, for which he then got a Grammy. And then I pivoted to Gary and said, "You know, you've got an incredible gift, and you're not using it right now, and that's why you're here." And when you talk to people, and then Gary said to me, "Give me 6 months." And that was 2008. And after a while, I and many other friends of his would stop trying to goad him into,
Right.
and this is one of the things Judd talked about at the memorial. He said, after It's Gary Shandling's show and after Larry Sanders, people always said, "Where's the third show?" And then Judd looks out at the audience, and it's Sarah Silverman, and it's Kevin Nealon, and it's Warren Beatty, and just David Steinberg, and Billy Crystal, and Ray Romano, and all these people. And Judd said, "We were the third show."
That's right.
Because for the last 10 or 15 years of his life, anytime any one of his friends wanted his time, he came to see this play 6 times. He came the opening night at the Geffen. He came to every different little reading I did, and he always gave me notes. So anyway, going back to the beginning of this, I called him up, "Can I read this to you?" Of course Gary's going to say yes, because that's who he was. And I had dinner at his house. We moved away the plates, and then I got out my script, and I had sticks with the heads of Jefferson, Dickinson, Tolstoy on the sticks. So that when I was reading, he would know who's talking. And he's staring at me for an hour. I read for an hour. And then he goes, "Let's stop and let's just talk." And he starts talking about, "Here's what I've heard so far." And I remember his first words were, "This is compelling. This is significant. This is," and he used the word symphonic. Mm-hmm. And so I'm taking notes, and he's writing things down. And then he looks at his watch, and he says, "It's late. Come back tomorrow night. Finish it." So I'm like Scheherazade. And so the next night I come back, we finish the play, he gives me more notes, and then I just start doing that. I did this 35 times. Second house was Norman Lear's. Ariana Huffington had me come over to her house, and that's where Shirley MacLaine saw it. And so Shirley MacLaine came up to me afterwards and said, "We need to have, I want to talk to you." So we had, a few days later, we have lunch in Malibu, and she first says to me, "The reason that the Star of Bethlehem was able to hover in the sky because it was not a star, it was a spaceship." And then she made the case for me adding Isaac Newton to the cast. And I said, "Look, I've been working on this since 1987, and at some point I've got to just stop."
Yeah.
And also Newton, when people, during talkbacks, people often say to me, "Why did you pick these 3 people?" Well, I didn't pick them. They picked me because they all, at different times, in different countries, did the exact same task. And
which is amazing.
It is amazing.
Yeah.
And there were other people who I've read since then who did things a little bit. Mark Twain has some biblical parodies, and Isaac Newton did some writing about it. Norman Mailer, Elizabeth Cady Stanton did a woman's Bible. But these 3 did a duplicate task.
Yeah, yeah. It really is an incredible play. We only have a few minutes left, but this is a fantastic story. I mean, of how you have done so much research into this whole project, and the result is a fantastic play. Not just a good play, a fantastic play, and we hope everyone gets a chance to see this.
Thank you very much.
It's truly amazing.
And you do it in a fun and entertaining way, but it is so very thought-provoking. Every single member of the audience comes away with something very powerful from this. But guess what? That something is not always the same. My goodness, the talk in the women's restroom after the show, or out in the courtyard after the show, or even during the talkback section.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, one person is saying, oh, it's so obvious that what you're doing is you're trying to, tell people that their religious beliefs, da-da-da-da-da-da, or, oh, what you're trying to tell us is that, the afterlife is really all about us looking into the lives we've led and how our lives have affected others around us. Or, oh, this is really about. So, it touched everyone in different ways.
It did. And
how did this process touch you? Because this started as a quest for you.
Well, what I would say is that it's been something so intrinsically enriching that at some point I almost became indifferent as to whether or not the play was a success.
Yeah.
And at the opening night of the play, I'd done 35 readings of it. I did 15 different workshops around the performances around the country with actors, including Tucson at the Invisible Theater, where I used to. That's where I got my start as a playwright, and still go back there all the time. And we had worked it out so much. All the actors in the first production, you're now seeing here, everybody was so incredible. Matt was great. And so I felt this journey is really complete. The fact that at the opening night the audience is standing and clapping was an extra bonus to something. And then also in the same way that Bill Moyers has become a friend, or Gary Shandling helped with this, or Norman Lear, or Ariane Huffington, different people, I have profited so much. There's a speech that Dickens has at the end where he's criticizing Jefferson. And that speech I learned about through Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, who we used to have on Real Time twice a year. And he wrote a biography of Jefferson called Thomas Jefferson, Author of America, a very good small volume. But he was also a Dickens scholar. So he said, have you looked at this one book that I'd never read, which is called American Notes, which was a book that Dickens read after he toured America for the first time. And the last chapter of that book is called Slavery. And it's just a searing indictment of this institution, which is the original sin of this country.
Amazing. And, and one last thing that I'm getting out of our conversation today is that the blessing you gave to Gary Shandling, too, that you allowed him to help you. You allowed him to do that third show. And I think it's a joint blessing that he gave to you. You gave that opportunity to him. I'm a big Gary Shandling fan. I've seen him many times, with his act. One of the funniest guys I've ever seen. And, about the big heart he had is nice to know, too. And I want to thank you for sharing that. It's a blessing.
It is a blessing, yeah.
Well, and giving us a window into not just these three men, but what it ends up being is opening a window for us to look inside of ourselves.
Yeah.
And I could watch this play
over and
over again and get something new out of it. And it's interesting because that's what Larry said. Larry Cedar. Sorry about that. Larry Cedar, that plays Jefferson. When we were doing the talk back, that's what he said. He said, you know what? This is a tight play. We really follow the script because it's such a tight play, and there's really not a lot of need to go off script at all in this.
Yeah.
But he also said that he consistently learns something new as he continues in this play.
Yeah.
And I think we can all learn from it. And Scott Carter.
Oh, thank you so much for being here.
Your opus just is awesome.
Thank you all.
I wish we had an hour. We'd love to have you on again, of course. And everyone to get out there tonight. It may be sold out, but check anyway, the Herberger Theater.
And tomorrow.
And
yes,
tomorrow.
The last 2 shows here in Phoenix for this run.
Yeah. So definitely get out there at Herberger Theater. Scott Carter, The Gospel According to Thomas Jefferson, Charles Dickens, and the Count Leo Tolstoy. Discord, phenomenal. Thank you, Scott Carter, for being here.
Thank you all.
You're more than welcome. And we'll take a quick break. We have another guest coming up in about 2 minutes. This is Breakthrough Entertainment Live on 1480 AM KPHX. We'll be right back.